Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here today in this exceptionally hot room. Hope everybody hangs on in there. And yeah, I'm kind of using this really, a bit cheeky of me, as the unofficial launch, really, of this book. And I'm really thrilled to share it with you because, as Tom said, my granddad really inspired this. He fought in the Third Arakan campaign, and I know there's some people here today, other descendants of those who fought, and I want to make a special welcome to those. And thank you very much for coming, because that's really, really important to me. And I did say to my husband as I was coming down in the lift, actually, that writing this presentation was 1,000 times harder than writing the book, because I was trying to fit like a book into 45 minutes. So I'm going to do my best to kind of give an overview of the campaign with a little bit of detail in there, because I know that there'll be some people in here super familiar with it. But also, you know, it's a very overlooked campaign, the Third Arakan, so we need to put it in context for those who aren't sure. And I'd like to begin really with a question. What comes to mind when we think of the Commandos in the Second World War? And probably images like these, so leading large assaults, whether that be D-Day, whether it be Operation Torch in North Africa or Husky in Sicily. Perhaps you might think of their roots in the kind of raiding and irregular warfare. My husband mentioned Norway, you know, those kind of Arctic scenes. These kind of iconic cinematic images that have really been drummed into us about the Commandos all have a broadly European focus. But while this was happening, there was another war going on in the Far East, as we all know. And I'd like to thank Rob Lyman for this graphic, which I edited because I couldn't work out how to do shapes on PowerPoint. So thanks, Rob, for that. And just a quick overview here. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just for those who aren't familiar with the Burma campaign, the Japanese invaded in January 1942, forcing the British into the largest retreat in their history, fighting a disastrous rearguard action all the way back to India. And they were very quick and very keen to retake Burma, perhaps too keen, because the first campaign where they attempted to do so was the first Arakan campaign, and that was an utter disaster. Troops went into action pretty much untrained, unprepared for the enemy they would face, the climate, and the landscape that they would be fighting in, not to mention commanded by some questionable characters and decisions that went on, but that's a talk for another day. By 1943, late 1943, early 1944, however, things had changed. There'd been a big change at the top, lots of reorganisation, lots of learning, lots of reflection, and the second Arakan campaign was far more successful. The failures of the first lessons had been learnt, and by 1945, which is late 1944, early 1945, which is where our story begins, the tide had well and truly turned against the Japanese. This dramatic change in Allied fortunes was largely thanks to these two chaps, particularly the one in the centre, General Bill Slim. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with him, commander of the 14th Army, and Lord Louis Mountbatten, who's somewhat a divisive figure, but, you know, supreme Allied commander in the theatre, and for me, had a big impact on what happened, because he was also, for our particular story, previously Chief of Combined Operations. And both these men, although they were from very different backgrounds and they were very different in their personalities, got on very well on the whole and worked together to tackle some of the problems that were dogging the British and Indian Army during those early years in Burma. They dealt with improving the health of the troops. They dealt with developing new tactics to better fight the Japanese. And probably the biggest thing from my perspective was really what they did to improve the morale of the men fighting in Burma. After the failures of the first Arakan campaign and the retreat out of Burma, the men in the British and Indian armies their spirit was pretty much broken, and this myth had developed around the Japanese Superman, the idea that they could not be beaten in battle in Burma. And Slim and Mountbatten both understood that for success and for victory to occur, that needed to change. Yes, you could do with more resources. Yes, new tactics, but actually morale, really, you know, you can't have victory without good morale in any fighting force, and they understood that. Mountbatten went on a tour around the front lines, giving rousing talks to the troops that he saw, and using this idea of the forgotten army, turning that on its head and using that to be a badge that these men could be proud of. So yes, they might have felt forgotten. Yes, they had fewer resources than the men fighting in Europe, but they could achieve the same results and more with less. And so it was really this idea of, yes, we are the forgotten army, but we can, and we will show them what we can do, that made a big change. And as the monsoon season of 1944 came to an end, plans were underway for another push into Burma, this time hoping to be the one that secured victory. And as part of this, with his background in combined operations, Mountbatten desperately wanted commandos. Quick background, the Commandos were formed in 1941, mainly for regular warfare purposes. They went through several reorganisations. In 1943, we had the formation of the mixed brigades. So that's the use of army commandos along with Royal Marine units. Originally called Special Service Brigades, which was shortened to SS Brigades. That didn't age well, so they reverted to Commando Brigades. Bit awkward there. And it was... Each brigade was given a geographic area in which they were to operate. And although Mountbatten wanted 2 or 3 brigades, they were somewhat busy in Europe with other things. And so he was given just 1, 3 Commando Brigade, formed of 1 Commando and 5 Army Commando, who were the more experienced Army Commando units, and the newly raised 4-2 and 4-4 Royal Marine Commandos, along with 3 troop Royal Engineer Commandos and some support troops. Originally commanded by Brigadier Nonwalia, who you can see here on the left. But unfortunately, he was taken ill just before the start of the Third Arakan campaign, and Lieutenant Colonel Peter Young, a name that, very famous among commando historians, I'm sure, and pretty much anybody actually who's in the army, a very audacious, charismatic man, took over as commander of the brigade as we went into the Arakan. But why did Arakan matter? Why were the British and Indian forces so intent on retaking this area? Well, it was all about location. Arakan is located on the western coast of Burma. It borders India to the north and the Bay of Bengal on its west coast, and is separated from central Burma by a mountain range, the Arakan Yomas, which are a spur of the Himalayas. So it's pretty much, in fact, originally Arakan was an independent kingdom, so it's pretty much separated entirely. There were 2 reasons why it was important. First, the defence of India, for which its location speaks volumes, but it was also very important for any offensive that was going to be launched in Burma because of its location, and this quote here really, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. It was all very well for the 14th Army to plan and advance down central Burma to Rangoon, but how they would supply their troops was another question. The landscape in Burma meant that there were very few transport routes over ground, and any force moving south through the country relied solely on air supply. And there's 3 lines that you'll see marked on this map. The red line is the limit of supply from the air bases around Kohima. And you can see that runs short at Mandalay, nowhere near Rangoon. The purple and blue lines, however, show the limit of air support and supply if the airfields in Arakan at Akyab and Ramri, respectively, could be taken and used by the Allies. So it was needed in order to secure not just victory in Arakan, but victory in the whole Burma campaign. And the task of securing it in order to bring about the reconquest of Burma was given to 15 Corps. They were operating entirely independently from 14th Army during the 1944-45 campaign, and they were truly a multinational force led by Lieutenant General Sir Philip Christison, who is an interesting chap. Again, I don't have time to talk about him today, but there's a book or 2 to be written about him, and some of his memoirs are quite generous to himself, I would say, to put it that way. The main divisions, the 26th Indian Infantry Division were fairly experienced. They'd fought in Arakan in the second Arakan campaign. The 25th Indian Infantry Division, however, were newly raised. They were originally raised to defend India, and many of the troops were completely untested in battle, completely new to Burma. There were some experienced in there, the Gurkhas, for example, but many of them were fresh and green to war. And they were joined by the 82nd and 81st West African Divisions, raised from units of the Royal West African Frontier Force, so men across British West Africa, including Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Gambia, and the Gold Coast. And I think there's going to be a talk later on today, which I hope to make it to, all about the West Africans. And of course, we had 3 Commando Brigade and supporting units in the Corps. So it was a remarkably diverse force, many different languages spoken, religions, cultures, really the perfect demonstration of the British and Indian Army in the Burma campaign. And success in the Third Arakan depended on their combined efforts. And the enemy that they faced would be no pushover. Opposing them was the Japanese 28th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai. Their main units, the 54th and 55th Divisions, were tasked with the defence of Arakan. And despite the recent defeats at Kohima and Imphal, the Japanese army was still a dangerous and determined force for 2 reasons: the ideology, this kind of ancient Bushido warrior code of no surrender and fighting to the death, and also because the tactics they used, this Suketsu doctrine, which focused on speed and decisiveness and these rapid outflanking manoeuvres by lightly armed infantry. It was something that the British Army had learned to have to deal with following the disastrous campaigns in 1942. But it was still, they were still a force to be reckoned with, and, the surprise and momentum that their troops brought into the battlefield had overwhelmed the Allies many times before. So going into things in 1944-45 was really putting to the test the new tactics that had been learned off the back of Second Arakan as well. By late 1944, Sakurai found himself a little bit short on troops, and in order to defend the large stretch of Arakan that he had to deal with, which was around 400 by 150 square miles of coastal terrains, mountains and jungle, he separated his troops into sort of 2 main task forces. Sakura Force, whose job were to hold the enemy in the Mayu Peninsula, which we'll come on to shortly, and Matsu Force, who were tasked with manning the counterattack area in the Kaladan Valley and further east. So the challenge facing 15 Corps in early 1945 then was to contain and destroy this determined and highly skilled enemy in some of the most punishing terrain on Earth. How did General Christensen plan to achieve this, I hear you ask? Well, the answer was Operation Romulus, a 3-pronged thrust down Arakan. The map is a little bit confusing, but just to summarise, we had the 25th Indian Division were to advance down the Mayu Peninsula that you can see on the far right of the map. They would be supported by the 82nd West African Division. They were tasked with capturing capturing the peninsula down to Akyab. And 81st West African Division were to provide protection to this advance by pushing south down the Kaladan Valley in the east, connecting with the 82nd Division at the ancient Arakanese capital of Myohong. The 26th Indian Infantry Division and 3 Commando Brigade were kept in reserve for the initial advance. It was their job was to undertake amphibious landings, hooking round the Japanese rear, initially to capture Akyab Island, and they were given a rough time frame of doing this by the 18th of February 1945. So bear that date in mind. And once again, the objectives, as we spoke about earlier, were pretty simple. They were to capture the airfields at Akyab and Ramri, contain the Japanese forces in Arakan, whilst doing so to prevent them from utilising one of the 2 major passes over the Arakan Yomas and opposing Slim's flank in his advance to Rangoon. Although Operation Romulus didn't officially begin until December 1944, preliminary operations actually began months earlier in the middle of the monsoon, which was in of itself a pretty audacious thing to do. The 25th Indian Division were brought in to hold the line that had been established during the second Arakan campaign and work on gathering intelligence, reconnaissance to Japanese positions so that when the main advance began in December, the British and Indian forces had a much better idea of the number and strength of the Japanese in the Mayu Peninsula. One of the biggest issues facing the beginning of Operation Romulus was to clear the high ground around the main lateral route across the Mayu Peninsula, which was the old railway tunnels. And this saw some of the first kind of really vicious fighting of this campaign, with the 3rd Battalion 2nd Gurkha Rifles tackling Hills 1433 and Tiger. I don't have time to talk about those in depth, although they are covered in the book. But there again, they're an example of some of the many forgotten battles of the Burma campaign, but they involved, hand-to-hand fighting. And these were veterans of Wingate's first Chindit operation. These were men who knew what they were doing, who were very experienced. And still, it took them 4 days to clear these 2 hills, and they suffered very heavy casualties. However, they did succeed in clearing the enemy, overlooking the advance. And it was this early Gurkha victory that really set the tone for what would be a methodical and determined push down the Mayu Peninsula by the 25th Division. 74th Brigade advanced down the coastal plain, leapfrogging down. 53rd Brigade moved partly by boat, actually, down the Kalapanzin River, supported by the West Africans, and it was a remarkable success. This fledgling division, who many people had their doubts about, actually arrived at the bottom of the Mayu Peninsula at Foul Point weeks ahead of schedule. And Christensen found himself wondering what to do. 26th Division, who were due to undertake the advance on Akyab, were still at Cox's Bazar, still in India. And so he decided the ace of spades were good enough for the job. And so the 26th Division were left at Cox's Bazar to prepare for other operations. And the task of taking Akyab, this estuarial island, this airfield that had eluded the British forces for best part of 3 years, was given to the 25th, and it would be spearheaded by the Commandos. And I think at this point it's a good time to just have a quick pause and reflect on the role of the Navy, because the Third Arakan campaign was one of the greatest examples of inter-service cooperation in Burma. It saw the first true combined operations in the theatre and the development of Chung warfare, so this kind of tropical rivers and swampland warfare. And that was due to the hard work of Naval Task Force 64 of the East Indies Fleet and the rather long-suffering Captain Duncan Codwise Hill, who had to deal with not only limited resources, but working in uncharted waters, with his objectives changing at short notice, sometimes a matter of hours, having to pull together his small fleet to deliver large numbers of troops across these kind of wild and tropical environments that the Navy had never really operated in to this extent. In fact, an example of this is that the original invasion of Akyab, he had to develop 4 separate plans depending on where the Japanese were, how 15 Corps were getting on, and in the end they were all scrapped because just before Christmas 1944, intelligence reached Christensen that the Japanese had actually withdrawn from Akyab. So all of that work, all of that burning the midnight oil, Captain Hill was told, don't worry about that, we're going in tomorrow, do us a new plan, we're going to call it Operation Lightning. And so it was. And the Commandos, much to their disappointment, I have to say, went into Akyab completely unopposed on the 3rd of January 1945. And here are some photos of the landing. So it was all pretty relaxed. But this bloodless capture of Akyab was not solely the result of Naval Task Force 64, nor was it as a result of the 25th Indian Division, but it was also thanks to these guys. And again, I don't have time, sadly, to talk about this in much depth, but advise you definitely to go to the talk later on today about the West African divisions, because it was their advance down the Kaladan Valley in the east of Arakan that forced the Japanese to withdraw from Akyab, essentially. They originally were, Christensen had his doubts about the West Africans, as did Bill Slim, I hate to say. But they were originally sent in to provide it's really a defensive role to screen the Indian divisions. But actually, what they managed to achieve, they proved themselves as a lethal striking force capable of operating behind enemy lines, completely independently, with neither wheeled transport nor animal transport. They head-loaded all of their gear in the traditional African way. And they were fighting against a very experienced Japanese commander, General Koba, and they had him on the run. They pushed around 100 miles deep into virgin jungle, scaling multiple mountain ranges. I mean, the Modoc Range, I think the highest peak there is about 3,500 feet, up and down, through the jungle, and they threatened to completely cut off the Japanese operating in the Maui Peninsula, forcing the 28th Army Commander Sakurai to rejig his plans, withdraw his troops from Akyab, and he planned to make a greater stand at the airfields at Ramri and further east in Arakan. So really, this contribution, often overlooked, but without them, Akyab would not have fallen so easily. It was clear to Christensen that with Romulus well ahead of schedule, there was now the opportunity to strike a blow further south into the Japanese rear. But to take full advantage of this situation, 15 Corps would need to move rather quickly. It was decided that the best chance of success lay with a direct amphibious assault on the hilly, jungle-covered Myebon Peninsula, some 30 miles southeast of Akyab, by 3 Commando Brigade and 25th Indian Division, from where a secure base could be established to launch operations against the village of Kangaw. With just 72 hours to plan and mount this operation, Duncan Hill was really happy about that. D-Day was set for the 12th of January. It was a huge ask for all the divisional commanders to put this together at such short notice. And it required the closest of cooperations between the Navy, Army, and Allied Air Forces. But at 7:30 a.m. on the 12th of January, the first wave of commandos hit the southern beaches of Myebon. And isn't Google clever? Taking a photo of it, which is amazing, I think, to see it. They hit the southern beaches, taking the Japanese by complete surprise. By mid-afternoon, 4-2 Commando, 5 Commando, and 1 Commando were all ashore and making their way inland. But as 4-4 Royal Marine Commando approached the shore, things began to unravel. By this time, the tide had receded, and men found themselves stuck around 400 yards out from the coast. And as they jumped over the side of the landing craft, they found themselves waist-deep in mud. And you can actually see the mud flats off Myebon in this photo. They are vast, and it is a black, sticky, sandy mud. It is real horrible stuff. Luckily, the Japanese defences around Myebon were not too fierce, although they were shelling. Some books say that they weren't, but first-hand accounts of this and the research that I've done as part of this book show that they were actually still shelling the landing parties during this period. And I've got a quote here that explains it better than I can. Officers, troop sergeant majors, and even the regimental sergeant major were seen sprawling in the mud, which managed to deprive some of us of our boots and socks. Some fellows stuck fast and had to be lifted up by people who had returned empty-handed from the beach. Mortars, Brens, airborne stretchers, and resuscitation boxes went under again and again. Men formed disorderly scrums, which somehow hung together and reeled towards the beach. The last man ashore from 4-4 Commando was a subaltern who arrived plastered in mud and completely naked. Such was the strength of the mud and the conditions that they had to wade through. Nevertheless, thanks to, frankly, the strength and the training that the Commandos has had, they managed to make it ashore with very few casualties. And over the coming days, 3 Commando Brigade advanced to capture a number of hills in the south of Myebon and clear the area of Japanese. They were followed by A Squadron from the 19th Indian Lancers and 74th Brigade, working their way up the peninsula. And there are many amazing stories about this advance, about taking the hills, tanks toppling off hills, Japanese snipers in trees, all kinds of things that I just don't have time to tell you about today. But by the 20th of January, what's incredible is that the men had managed to clear 6 square miles of jungle and hills and secure the peninsula on basically no sleep and no rations, despite the hardships, despite the lice, despite the tropical diseases, and despite completely running on empty. The morale was very, very high. And now that 15 Corps had gained a strategic foothold behind the Japanese, the stage was set for the attack on Kangaw. Kangaw was one of the most heavily defended areas in Arakan by the Japanese. It was there was a sector unit there, the Kangaw sector unit, which after Akyab had been taken, was reinforced by many of the men who had been fighting in the Mayu sector. And an approach overland was quickly ruled out, not just due to the defences facing the north and west, but also the landscape. As you can see, you've got these waterways here up to the north and the hills. It would have made it absolutely impossible. Instead, the Commandos would undertake another amphibious assault from the south, and this would be unlike any other in the war, because it wouldn't take place from the sea, but from the Dangbong Chung, a narrow, fairly shallow, winding river flanked by mangrove forests and thick jungle. 2 beachheads, although that's quite a generous name, they were barely beaches, they were gaps in the mangrove trees, were picked as landing zones, and from there the men would have to advance to seize no fewer than 9 hills in order to reach Kangaw. The plan was to cut the road running north to south through Kangaw village, therefore blocking one of the few overland routes that the Japanese were using to resupply their forces and to contain those troops left in northern Arakan. Early on the 22nd of January then, the Commandos piled into a motley array of landing craft, since the sloops of Force 64 were too big, their draft too deep to make their way up the Chung. So you had this bizarre mix of cast-off landing craft from Europe, Fairmile flotilla motor launches, anything really that would float, was sent off in convoy on a 22-mile journey south and then hooking round up the Dangbong Chung where they were to land. And it was a very tense journey. I find it very difficult to imagine this, even when I was researching and reading and listening to accounts of the men who were there. It's very difficult to put yourself in the mindset of men going into almost uncharted waters here. Although some reconnaissance was done, very little was known about the Japanese positions. And you had the noise of the jungle around you. Visibility was next to zero on the banks. The creak of the mangrove roots, the noise of monkeys, bird calls, and the men had to be absolutely silent. Luckily, after several hours, they reached the landing zone undetected by the Japanese. And 1st Commando were the first to head ashore, being the most experienced unit of the brigade. They waded through mangrove roots and across paddy fields to dig in on the southern end of the first and largest hill outside Kangaw, Hill 170. Followed by 5 Commando, whilst 4-2 Royal Marine Commando were tasked with securing the beachheads and connecting the 2 landing zones. Once again, 4-4 Royal Marine Commando were last to land. Now, the Japanese response to the landing, it was initially very slow. They'd been taken completely by surprise because the Commandos had essentially come in the back door. That gave them enough time to dig in on the southern side of 170. But soon, as evening drew in on that first night, shelling began. And the Japanese launched 2 probing attacks, really to try and ascertain the strength of the Commandos in the area. Both of these attacks were repulsed, but it was a long night. The Commandos had to box in, a tactic they had learned in their training at Aknakari, but also one which had been developed as part of the Burma campaign. This was in an attempt to avoid encirclement tactics used by the Japanese. And as morning broke, the Japanese receded off, having gained a little bit of information about Allied strength. 4-4 Commando, on the morning of the 23rd, prepared for their first taste of operations at Kangaw. They were tasked with leapfrogging further inland to take two hills, Milford and Pinner, which you can see just in the centre of the map here. And it was essential to take these two steep features. The hills weren't as big as 170, but they did block the route to Kangaw village. So it was very, very important that these were taken swiftly. And this is a picture of Pinner as it looks today. On the 23rd of January 1945, it became the scene of some of the hardest fighting of the operation. When they arrived, the Marines found Pinner to be unoccupied and quickly dug in. It was quiet, but it was perhaps too quiet. The scene was pretty much lifeless, putting the Marines on edge immediately. And they would prove to be right. This would be the calm before the storm, because beneath the moonlight, around 8 p.m. on the 23rd of January, enemy artillery ranged in and mortar fire opened up on 4-4's northern flank. The Japanese, unbeknownst to 3 Commando Brigade, had been watching. And they knew too well all their positions, essentially. 3 men from 4-4 were wounded in this first tentative shelling on the hill, I would say. But in the paddy fields below, the commandos could hear the braying of mules, commands given in Japanese, and they knew that more was to come. The men on this hill, my granddad included, and I know some other fathers and grandfathers of people in the audience who today were on Pinner, could see nothing. They looked out of the hill and all there was darkness, the bamboo scrub obscuring their view. Suddenly a red very light shot up and all hell broke loose as the Japanese launched a vicious counterattack. Machine gun fire swept the forward trenches and artillery from the paddy fields below Pinner blasted the Marines at point-blank range. The noise was deafening, and soon the area was thick with smoke. One of the biggest problems, and the thing that caused the largest number of fatalities and casualty on Pinner, were tree blasts. The Japanese targeted the thickly wooded Pinner, and the trees literally exploded, sending splinters everywhere. So not only were they having to avoid the shelling, but they were having to try and get out of the way of all this chaos that was going on. And all of this was soon followed by the first infantry attack, with the Japanese frantically advancing up the side of the hill through their own shelling. Marines guarding the forward slope were unfortunately killed, but the enemy knew this terrain well. They knew where they were going, they knew what they were doing. And somehow, amid all of this chaos in the darkness, 4-4 Commando managed to hold their box. They managed to stop the Japanese infiltrating into the middle of where they were fighting, with the only intruder being a porcupine who staggered into a trench alongside the regimental sergeant major, promptly expelling all of his quills before leaving. And it was thanks to the training that the commandos had had at Aknakari, their fire discipline in not revealing their positions too soon, and their grit and determination that they managed to hold out through the night. They had suffered 16 killed and 45 wounded, but Japanese dead littered the hill, and attention soon turned back to Hill 170, where the Allies understood that another counterattack was due to occur at any point. Over the next few days, as expected, Japanese resistance in the area intensified. They were desperate to hold on to the road at Kangaw, and sector leader Colonel Murayama had issued orders for a huge attack to be unleashed on Hill 170 to dislodge the commandos, and he had instructed his men to fight to the death in order to do so. Shelling gradually ramped up on 170 to the point where on the 27th of January, the bombardment was so fierce, 164 shells were counted as falling within just half an hour. Peter Young was quoted, and one of the effects of one of these shells. One shell was a direct hit on a trench where 3 artillery men were acting as flash spotters. Hearing the shell land and the screams that followed, I ran up to see a ghastly scene. One man was practically unrecognizable as a human being. Another was running about, temporarily unhinged by the sight of his dismembered friend. The Japanese were attempting to wear down the Commandos' resolve in any way that they could. And on the 31st of January, they launched their main infantry assault, infiltrating around the back of one commando and launching a suicidal attack on the tanks of the 19th Lancers. Wave after wave of infantry attacks on 170 followed. And it was some of the most intense close-quarters combat of the Burma campaign and perhaps the entire war. Men throwing themselves at the forward trenches, swords, bayonets, hand-to-hand fighting, the Japanese utilising every tactic and trick in their book to try and unnerve the commandos. And in the middle of this maelstrom, one man's actions came to symbolise the ferocity and determination of the commandos' defence, George Knowland. Knowland knew the men of 4 Troop 1 Commando were hanging on by a thread in the forward trenches, and in an effort to prove to them that they could succeed, he repeatedly exposed his position to the enemy by getting out of the trench, carrying ammunition to men who needed it, throwing grenades, hopping from foxhole to urge his men on. One veteran of 1 Commando later commented, "I don't know if he was mad or very, very brave." Seizing a 2-inch mortar, he fired from his hip in full view of the enemy before launching himself into another foxhole as a Japanese attack went in, where he snatched a Tommy gun and made a last stand, standing on the precipice of the trench, where he was mortally wounded. His inspirational courage would result in a posthumous Victoria Cross. And most importantly, it wasn't just his actions in themselves, but it was the courage and inspiration that he served to his men that made all the difference, allowing them to hang on until reinforcements from the rest of the brigade arrived. And it wasn't long before the full brigade was on 170 and were involved in the battle in some way or another. If not fighting, they were desperately trying to help supply the men who were. Every bullet, every grenade on Hill 170 had to be hauled up from the beachhead, and in turn it had come from Myebon up the Chong. So it was a real test of logistics to supply them. And there was chaos on the southern slopes at this point as well. Wounded were trailing in from the top of the hill, and I must take a point here to mention the Indian stretcher bearers. Their bravery on 170 is again often overlooked, but it was them who evacuated the commandos out to HMIS Nevada, the big sloop of 464, which was moored crosswise across the Dangbong Chong, operating as a hospital ship at the time. By the 1st of February, Kangaw Sector Unit Commander Murayama had lost contact with all of his men on 170 and reluctantly ordered a withdrawal. Finally, 1 Commando were relieved in full by 5 Commando, and it wasn't until the day after that the true extent of the Commando's victory became clear. The day after the battle, 340 Japanese dead were counted on the hill, but this would rise to 700 just 2 days later. Peter Young remarked that he had never seen dead so thick. Some men, Japanese and Allied, were found alive buried underneath piles of corpses. It was an incredible scene, and really, it was a microcosm of these two enemies, these two different ideologies meeting on a battlefield. This Japanese ferocity, this idea of seemingly futile, endless attacks, and the resolve and determination of the commandos. The battle for 170 was over, but its aftermath undoubtedly left an indelible mark on all that fought there. General Christensen summed it up with this message to 3 Commando Brigade as they were withdrawn from the Kangaw area. Through your exploits at Akyab, Myebon and Kangaw, and the valuable reconnaissance which you have made along the Arakan coast, you have gained a reputation throughout the Corps for indifference to personal danger, for ruthless pursuit in success, and for resourceful determination in adversity, which has been the source of inspiration to your comrades in arms. In the operations at Kangaw, 3 Commando Brigade had lost 45 killed and a further 90 wounded. And there were many casualties, many acts of heroism, which I cover in detail in the book. They were finally withdrawn on the 2nd of February for some well-earned rest back to Myebon. And the victories of of the Battle of Hill 170 and Pinner were pretty catastrophic for Murayama's forces, and the Kangaw sector unit was more or less destroyed. The rest of his forces, those fighting in the Kaladan, the rest of Matsu force, Japanese forces that were in the Kaladan, were withdrawn, and the Japanese were now desperately trying to get round the blockade at Kangaw using numerous paths and trekking through the jungle in an effort to try and reach the south. To put it in context, the rider efforts of the Corps, 74th Brigade were advancing on Kangaw from the north, the West Africans were closing in down the Kaladan Valley, the Japanese were now entirely encircled, and the Allies were able to capture the airfields at Ramri Island and Chejuba Island. It's important to remember, though, that Kangaw wasn't just about the commandos. It was a victory that was built hill by hill. There were 9 hills that had to be captured. And we must take a moment to mention the Indian troops who fought alongside the commandos. It actually, at Kangaw, was the first and only occasion, actually, that an Indian was to command an infantry brigade in action during the Second World War. This is Colonel Timaya, who took temporary command of the 51st Brigade during the battle. And there were many acts of bravery carried out by Indian troops as well as the commandos. Unfortunately, these were often overlooked, whether it's a case of prejudice against the Indian forces. There certainly were many occasions where arguably I would say VCs were deserved. Certainly they were recommended by commanding officers, but you'd find they'd be bumped down to Indian orders of merit or the like, probably something to do with the fact that, that they were Indian, unfortunately. But the wider fight was a success. The blockade was now firmly in place, and all features were held by British, Indian and African troops by the 18th of February. The fighting at Kangaw had lasted 22 days, and the Japanese had suffered in the region of 2,000 casualties, so 4/5 of their force, whereas Allies had suffered around about 600. It was a decisive blow to 15 Corps' campaign, and by the spring of 1945, Christenson's men had done everything that had been asked of them and more. They'd captured all the airfields vital for Slim's advance, and they'd managed to shatter and contain the 54th and 55th Japanese divisions, preventing them from being redeployed to reinforce troops defending Rangoon. This advance had spanned not just jungles, not just swamplands, but mountains, plains, rivers and beaches, and was a remarkable demonstration of tri-service cooperation and ingenuity with scant resources. And with Romulus down, 14th Army, the progress of 14th Army in central Burma accelerated, and it was determined that Rangoon could be captured before the monsoon. It was actually 26th Division who undertook the amphibious assault on Rangoon on the 2nd of May, Operation Dracula. The Japanese had already evacuated, so the landings met with little resistance. It's a photo, so you can see that not much resistance going on there. The cost of 15 Corps' success was great, however. They'd been 6 months of fighting, resource-starved. 224 Group RAF, who supported them, had lost 78 aircraft. The Navy had fired 23,000 rounds, and 54,000 men and 1,000 vehicles had been moved around during these amphibious operations, a huge number given the conditions. And 15 Corps themselves had suffered 1,155 killed, a further 5,000 casualties. But their sacrifice had ensured that 14th Army's lifeline had remained intact. And without them, the operation to capture Rangoon would have been seriously delayed, if indeed it had happened at all. So while Slim's success in central Burma is rightly celebrated, we should never forget the men of 15 Corps who fought this relentless battle on the margins that quietly enabled victory. For those who survived, the return home was much quieter than their comrades who had fought in Europe, as we well know. And I just wanted to end by sharing a little bit about a trip that was organised for them to return back to Kangaw. I believe it's the only time a group of veterans had the opportunity to return there since 1945. And it was arranged by Remembrance Travel, the Royal British Legion, and my grandfather, Ted Sims, who helped to get the word out among the Commando Association. And yeah, it was a real cathartic moment, because many of these men didn't get back to their homes until 1947, and they did indeed feel forgotten, and this gave them the opportunity to go back to where they lost so many of their friends. And that's really the reason why I wrote Jungle Commandos, was to give their story the attention it deserves, and to share the names of Kangaw and Myebon, names which when I was young, people looked at me blankly when I mentioned, but that hopefully today many more people will understand. And I just wanted to share this video of some of the veterans on Pinner, I believe, laying a few crosses and taking a moment to reflect on the things that had happened there 60 years ago when this was filmed. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions if we've got time.